last week, culminating yesterday in Nashville with a march that was entitled Science Matters, was really the primary thing that was said about it. And the very first sign that was shown on the news last evening was the idea that science is my superhero who is yours. And I think that there is this thought that we have to make science and religion completely diametrically opposed to one another. And that people have the idea, at least some people have the idea, that if you're religious, that you simply cannot be scientific, that that's impossible, and that that's just, those two things are incompatible. So I want to talk about that a little bit this morning. Are science and religion in opposition to each other? I mean, is that true? Is it true that if you are a religious person that you cannot be scientific minded? You know, I was kind of reminded of something. I watched a movie last week about the three ladies that were involved in the space program. Each of them played a different part. One of them a mathematician, one a computer mind, and the other an engineer. Of course, the storyline was that they were all black and that there were some real problems because of integration or segregation at the time. But the thing that impressed me was this. Every single one of those women were very religious women. Now, I suspect if you'd have looked into the space program that existed in the 60s, you would have found that most of those people were religious. I think you would find that to be true. And yet, despite the fact that they were very religious people, they were capable of using science to eventually send a man to the moon. Now, that really dispels this idea that if you're religious, you can't be a scientist. I mean, it really does, and you need to understand that. But the one thing that really bothers me about it is that people are trying to put, as you sometimes would express it, a guilt trip on you. They want to say to you and try to say to you that if you are religious, that you are just, I don't know what the word would be, but you're kind of just not up the level that you ought to be intellectually, to put it kind. So we want to talk about that a little bit this morning and just really trying to give some comfort to you as a Christian to say, hey, you know, you what? You're not a dummy because you're religious. That doesn't make you dumb or ignorant. That just simply is not true. And that sign that was put on the TV last night, that's what it was attempting to express. That I believe in science, and what is your superhero? That's basically the idea. And, of course, making the fun of the idea of God would undoubtedly be what the person was trying to do. But I want to ask you a few questions because this is something that sometimes comes up and we need to realize. You know, there have been problems on both sides of this question. The Scopes monkey trial that happened in Tennessee many years ago. Been a movie written about it. You've probably seen it. Been a book written about it and a movie made about the book. And of course, at that time, you had those who believed in that God created the heavens and the earth and therefore created man. And they did not wish for other people to have a voice. They wanted to silence anyone who would say that there was the possibility or set forth the theory that man evolved from lower creatures. Now, in today, that's flipped. Today, that's not true. Today now, on the other side, those who believe in the theory of evolution want to silence those who believe in creation. Is it ever right to try to silence people? Is it ever right to try, if you disagree with them, to make sure that they have no means of being heard? Is that something that you would think to be right? Back in the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 22 and verse 8, there's an example of King Ahab, and he was a fellow who didn't want to hear anything that he didn't want to hear. That's the way a lot of people are today. We don't want to hear it. We want people who believe differently than we do to be silenced, to not have the opportunity to speak. And you look there in verse 8 of that chapter, and he was having a conversation, and we've read this before, with Jehoshaphat. I love that name, always have. With Jehoshaphat, who was the king of Judah. And they were getting ready to go to war, and they were calling in various people and asking for advice. And Jehoshaphat said, well, isn't there a prophet of the Lord besides that we might inquire of him here? And the king said, and his message is what a lot of people would say today. Yet there is yet one man, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord. But I hate him. Why do I hate him? I hate him because he doth not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. I think there are a lot of people in today's world that are kind of like that. If I don't agree with you, then I don't want you to have an opportunity to speak. And that's kind of where we are. We've kind of gotten to the point that we don't want to discuss anything. We don't want to set forth ideas on both sides of a question. We just want to silence the opposition so that they have no voice to speak. Is that something that we ought to do? I'm going to tell you right quickly, I don't mind people setting forth their ideas about the evolutionary process, as long as they're fair with it. I don't mind people talking about the idea of how they believe the earth came into existence by some type of a giant explosion in the past, as long as they are setting that forth and they're allowing me to set forth the idea that I believe that God created the heavens and the earth. I don't have a problem with that. And I think in doing that and allowing people to speak on both sides of a question, that I'm following the example of God. You know, even God himself, in the book of Job, chapter 1, allowed Satan to have an audience. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto him, Hast thou considered my servant Job? There is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth or hateth evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? And he set forth his opinion. Hast thou not made an hedge about it, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Just proceed with the theory that you have. You know, God didn't silence Satan. God didn't strike him and say, I'm not going to allow you to speak to man. I mean, you can even go back to the Garden of Eden and you see that that's true. God has always allowed there to be both sides of an issue presented among men. In the second chapter, in the first 6 verses, after this situation, when things began to proceed, Satan comes again. The sons of man came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them again. And the Lord said unto Satan, From whence comest thou? And he said, From going to and fro in the earth, walking up and down in it. And the Lord said, The same question, Hast thou considered my servant Job? There's none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man. And Satan answered the Lord and said, Skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath, he will give for his life. But put forth thine hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, he is in thine hand, but save his life. It's kind of interesting to me that in both of these circumstances, there was a conversation of controversy between God and Satan. And God, in both cases, allowed Satan to speak his piece, to say what he had to say. To me, there's only one reason that someone doesn't allow another person to speak. The only reason you don't allow another person to speak is because you're afraid of what they might say and that it might be hurtful to the position that you occupy. There's no other reason to not allow them to speak. In my opinion, I think the Lord thought like people today think. Yeah, just let him talk because he'll hang himself. And that's probably true. My belief is that if a person occupies a position that's not the truth, if you let him speak long enough, the fact that it's not true will begin to be apparent to those who hear him or her, whichever the case may be. So I kind of have this idea that, we don't need to silence the critics. I mean, religious people have tried to do that through the years. We don't want to listen to someone who doesn't agree with us. I think it really shocks people sometimes come to our Bible classes and we have an open discussion. And sometimes if someone disagrees with the preacher or the class teacher, that just shocks people that you don't have an official position and you can't hear anything else. You know what? If you want to speak up in the Bible class, you can say whatever you want to, but you have to expect to be withstood. You have to expect to be objected to if the person that you're speaking to doesn't agree with you. We need to reach the point that we're willing to listen. But a lot of folks are not. They don't want to listen. They only want one side of a conversation to be heard. The Apostle Paul, when he went to Athens in Acts 17, that was an idolatrous city, and it was also a very educated city. A lot of people don't realize it, but Nashville, Tennessee is called the Athens of the South. The reason that it's called the Athens of the South is because it has so many universities there. I really don't know how many universities are in Nashville. I couldn't count them. Maybe you do, but I don't. But there are a lot of them. I'm sure if I began to count them, I'd miss somebody. And so it's called the Athens of the South. Athens, Greece, was the center of learning in the ancient world. And if you get there to verse 16, when Paul got there, and he began immediately in verse 17, the first thing, he disagreed with the Jews. They believed that Jesus was a fraud. He believed he was the Messiah. So he disputed in the synagogue with the Jews and with devout persons in the market daily with them that met with him. And then he came across certain of these philosophers, Epicureans and Stoics, the predominant people of the day. And he encountered them, and some of them said, "What will this babbler say?" But even to their credit, they believed he was a babbler. They believed what he said was false. They believed that it was not something that had any basis in truth. But they also said to him, in verse 19, they took him, they brought him to Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is? For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean." Is that the way you react when you hear something that you've not heard before? You say, "Hey, you know what? I want to examine this. I want to see if this is the truth or it's not. I want to examine it." A lot of people in today's world don't want that to happen. I mean, if you have a lot of folks who believe that God doesn't exist, they don't want a person who believes in God to have any voice to speak that at all. They want to silence that in whatever way they can. I don't have a problem with a person who doesn't believe in God saying, "I don't believe there's a God." But let's have a conversation about it. Let's don't just say, "Okay, you're going to silence you, and you're not going to be allowed to speak in the future." I'll tell you how you silence people. In the only way that Jesus ever did. You have to realize that Jesus had the ability to do whatever he wished. He said to Pilate, he could call these 12 legions of angels if he wanted to deliver him, but he didn't do it. But I tell you what he did do. What he did do is he involved himself in conversation with people. In the 22nd chapter of the book of Matthew, two major conversations with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And when he got through those conversations, it said, "No man was able to answer him a word, neither does any man from that day forth ask him any more questions." Why? Because he had exposed what they were saying is false. It wasn't true. What we need to do, rather than just say, "Well, I don't want to hear what anybody else has got to say," we need to be listening to other people. Pay attention. Present your arguments. I have convinced that our American judicial system is probably the most fair place you'll ever go. Now, you don't like it sometimes, I know. I know sometimes you say, "Boy, this idea the courts are so bound, it's just terrible." But understand that you have a group of 12 people who are going to hear evidence, and when the case is concluded, they're told by the judge to reach a conclusion about what the evidence supports, and that their decision has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, you think of that. You think of all the arguments that you hear, and you think of presenting those arguments before a group of people and letting them make a decision as to which is the most plausible beyond a reasonable doubt. What do you think the decision would be? Well, that's kind of an interesting thought. Jesus says, "I'm going to silence people because I'm going to expose them for not adhering to the truth." I've never believed that truth has anything to fear from honest discussion. I don't believe it now. I don't mind a religious debate. If someone called here and said, "I don't agree with the position that you have religiously, I'd like to debate that issue with you," if the elders of the congregation would permit it and allow it, and I suppose they would, I don't have any problem with having a debate here in the building. That doesn't bother me. I don't see the problem with that. If I believe that what I'm teaching is the truth, I ought to be confident in it. If I'm not confident in it so much that I want everybody else to be silenced, then there's a real problem. And I think that's the one thing that we need to realize when we think about this question. Are science and religion compatible? First thing is you can't try to shut each other up. You've got to listen to the arguments that are made. Now let's ask this question. Are science and God opposing ideas? Let's think about that for a moment. I have talked about this a lot in the past, and I know you may get tired of hearing it, and you think, boy, Nathan, he talks about one of his favorite subjects. But this kind of came up. It's something that was done, and I just didn't feel like I could just ignore it. Where people are trying to belittle me as a Christian and my belief in God. I just don't like the idea of them saying you're not scientific. The Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy, and he wrote this, "O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust." Now he said, avoid profane and vain babblings. Now what he's talking about is he's talking about things that really are arguments that people make that don't actually prove a point. They just confuse the issue. And oppositions, he used the expression of science falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith, grace be with you, amen. I believe that there are a lot of things that people present in the name of science that are not scientific. I believe that. I've always believed that. I believe it to be now. True. Now, I think I owe you an explanation, and I'll give you one. God is something we believe in because we see evidence of existence. God is not a scientific fact. It is not. A scientific fact is a body of belief that we can either observe it or we can reproduce it by experimentation. But God is not in that category. We read in Hebrews 11:1 what faith is. Faith is not that. Faith is not the five senses provide us with the body of facts. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And verse 6 says that we must believe that He is, talking about God, and that He has rewarded them that is seeking. So I don't have any problem with that. When I look at science, I believe the body of facts that have been proven to be true. I believe those. I go to a chemistry class and do experiments, I believe the result. I go to someone who says go into nature and I observe the things that happen, and that's a fact. I don't have any problem with that. Now, when it comes to God, God doesn't fall into that category. And Christians need to admit that. We need to admit that God doesn't fall into that category. We're looking at evidence of His existence. We're not looking at Him. But this is the problem sometimes we get into. The scientists sometimes want to make this a real distinction between the two. And here's the problem. True science can only deal with things that can be observed and demonstrated. Period. Now that's a fact. Otherwise, it's not a scientific fact. Science cannot deal with origins, and that's one of the big problems we're having right now, is that you're made fun of when you say that God created the heavens and the earth, and people say everybody knows the earth came into existence by some type of a huge explosion in time past. But the problem is, that is not a scientific fact. It simply is not. That is a theory that someone has set forth. Now, if somebody wants to set forth a theory and say, I believe the earth came into existence 15 billion years ago by some type of giant explosion, and here are the evidence to present to make you believe that that's true, and I have any problem with that. But when they say this is a fact that is established, I do have a problem with that because it's not. It simply is not and cannot be. And to me, Job 38 is the as they use the expression, quintessential passage to prove that. The Lord answered Job and asked him a question. Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Now you're talking about people who are talking about what happened 15 billion years ago. We don't know what happened 100 years ago, much less 15 billion. 15 billion years ago, and we're going to say that we know exactly what happened. We don't know what happened. That is not a scientific fact. Period. He goes on to say, gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of you. And he asks a question. Where wast thou when I laid the foundation of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? Just think about it. Think about all the things we don't know. Science deals with things that are. God accounts for their existence. And that's really where I kind of come from. I don't have any problem studying the universe. And I know that it's an amazing thing, and I realize it. But when I began to think about where it came from, science can't do that. Science just cannot. It's not possible. Now, you can run around and yell and scream and beat your chest and say everybody else is a bunch of fools because they don't agree with me. But it doesn't change anything. It just doesn't. And we need to realize it. We don't need to let people cause us to be stomped into silence. Now, let me ask you this question. I'm going to ask 3 questions, and this is simple. It's a pretty easy lesson. Does science matter in answering the following questions? And I want to ask 3 questions, and I want you to consider them. Does the physical universe demonstrate characteristics consistent with the idea that it was designed? Or does the physical universe demonstrate characteristics consistent with the idea that it came into existence by an accidental occurrence, such as an explosion? Have you ever seen an explosion? You ever been where a bomb dropped? Well, I have. And I never did see a house jump out of a lumberyard. Never saw it happen. Now, you say that's oversimplification. No, that's not oversimplification. An explosion does not lead to order, ever, period. It leads to disorder, by definition. So when you begin to say, okay, we're going to account for all the order that we see in the universe by an explosion, I mean, immediately, I don't agree with the conclusion you reached. I believe you're misinterpreting the facts. I believe the facts that you're looking at, that the universe exists with all the order it has, I believe it came about because someone created it, a higher power than you and me, and you believe it came about as a result of an explosion. Now, which does the evidence support? That's what I think we have to do. Well, here's what I want to ask you. When you think about the simplicity of Hebrews 3 and 4, but the truthfulness of it, and then you begin to ask other questions. Hebrews 3 and 4 says, every house is builded by some man. Anything that has evidence of design had a designer, is another way you might put that. He that built all things is God. I'm going to tell you something you're amazed by if you watch that movie that I watched the other night. Is this lady who went to college in the 6th grade and became intelligence level I can't even explain. But she was working these formulas, and what she was doing was working the trajectory and all these things, taking all these things in consideration. But you know what? It has to be true for that, any of that to work. There has to be absolute laws that have set in motion that never vary. Never. Now the question is, does an explosion bring that about? And the answer is it does not. It never brings that about. Now let's ask a few questions and let's think about it. If you have a person who says that there is no design in the universe, period, no designer, and therefore no design. If I point to any other thing in existence, like a house, a car, a computer, a television, and I ask the question, do you believe it is possible for that to have come about without someone designing it and that design being followed? I know what the answer would be, and it would be no. And then why am I suddenly, when you point to the existence of the whole universe, more complex than a television set or a computer, that you're going to expect me to say, okay, that's all right. I'll accept that. Realize what you're talking about. You know, the simple facts are, every house is built by some man, you know that. When you ride down the road and you see a house, you have never once ever said, there must have been an explosion on that lot when the lumber was stacked there. You've never said that. Never. And you say, oh, that's oversimplification. No, it's not oversimplification. It's just a simple truth. Explosions do not lead to order. They lead to disorder. That is a fact that everyone knows and understands. But if a person is determined that he's not going to believe that God exists, there has to be some explanation for the universe. And I've about figured out the only way that you can ever explain that is to push it so far back in history that it's untraceable. If you keep pushing it back. You see, here's the problem. When I was in school and I was reading the charts, in 1968, I was reading the charts that the earth was approximately 500 million years old. Now, when my children were in school, in the high school in the 80s and 90s, in the 2000s, that number had been pushed up. So it got to about 3 to 5 billion years because everybody realized, we got to get a lot of time to explain it. Now we pushed it to 15 billion. You know what my prediction is? One of these days we're going to say that's not enough time either. We're going to push it out even further back into the past. Because the further we can push it, the more plausible it becomes. But let me tell you something. I don't care how far you push it. This universe shows evidence of design, period. Push it as far as you want to. It still shows evidence of design. Second thing is this. Has man ever discovered that what was accepted as scientific fact was actually wrong? Has that ever happened? I just gave you an example. 68, we thought the earth was 500 million years old. Get into the 80s, we thought it was 3 to 5 billion years old today. Scientists say, it's 15 billion years ago. At what point will they decide that's not correct either? I don't know. But I suspect it's going to happen. If you look into the evolutionary discussion, the discussion of evolution, you realize that Charles Darwin's book was really the standard, but it is not now. In fact, if you read a modern Origin of Species and you look at the introduction to it written by a modern scientist, they will tell you that this book is faulty, its thoughts are faulty, and therefore that it's not what modern biologists would accept. Now that's fact. How many things do you know of that scientists will say that's wrong that he once believed? I know I sometimes laugh about it and tell you, right now at this present time, I think that eggs are acceptable food. But there has been times that the scientific community have just absolutely said you should never eat one. Coffee is another example. Now we begin to tell you, coffee is a good thing. Used to be all horrible, going to kill everybody. We just don't know as much as we think we know. And when I go back to Romans 3 and verse 3, here's something that I ask you the question. I want you to consider it. What if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? Does it really make any difference what man believes to be true? Well, the fact is, no. It does not. It makes no difference what you believe to be true. You may or may not be correct. Bruce Jenner thinks he's a woman, but he's not. Look at his DNA. You know he's not. Now, you say whatever you want. Now, he's got a privilege to do whatever he wants to do. He can go around pretending to be a woman if he wants to. I don't care. I believe it's sinful. I believe it's wrong, but that's his prerogative from a standpoint of the law. But here's the problem. It doesn't change anything. In verse 4, he says, God forbid. Yea, let God be true, but every man a liar. Now you think about that. When any statement is made, you can't trust what man says because he may or may not be correct. And if you want examples of where man has been wrong, then I just suggest you start looking at history and how many mistakes scientifically man has made. Would you like me to give you a few of them? You do realize that the only reason the United States of America exists is because men believed the earth was flat. And there were certain men who did not believe that and who set out to prove that it was not and tried to sail around the earth. And that's the only reason they ever found it. Took a long time for people to change their thinking. People were killed. They were crucified. Their bones were dug up and they were burned because they didn't believe the earth was flat. But we now know positively. In that movie, one of the things that was really interesting was, and I remember it from when it happened, when John Glenn went out in the first orbit and he looked out the window and he saw the earth. All of a sudden, all that man had said in the past about the earth being flat was completely disproven by scientific knowledge. There it is. Not by evidence of some cable swinging and showing the rotation, but by an actual picture. There it is. Let me tell you something. People need to realize something. Now, I don't have any problem with people believing anything they want to. It's a free country. Believe whatever you wish. But just don't try to make me look like a buffoon because I believe in God. That's really my only point. In 1 Corinthians 1, here's what God said. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. He's done that over and over and over again. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? Now, if you were to get you a book and begin to read of all the things that man has believed that turned out to be false, I'm talking about the scientific community, you'd have a big book. So, all of a sudden, why are we going to believe this theory that's advanced at this time rather than that theory that was advanced at that time? Let me ask you a third question. Are there truths that we don't know yet? How many truths, how many things do you think that are true that we don't know? Let me tell you something interesting. I don't know if it's true or not. I just remember many years ago reading, and I don't remember the year, so you'll have to pardon my memory, that at some point along in the 1940s or 50s, that all of the information and all the knowledge that man had ever gathered, if you were to bundle it together, that from that point to the present day, we have far exceeded all that previous knowledge we ever learned. And you know what the primary reason for that is? Well, what happened in that movie, if you saw it, about the three ladies? What changed the space program? The computer. The computer. You know, you can think you're pretty smart and you're a pretty good mathematician, but you can't keep up with the computer. And that has changed things dramatically. Now, if you go to any scientific research, the primary tool used in scientific research is a computer. Even if you're a professional golfer, if you look at the commercials on TV, what's your major tool you use to improve your game? The computer. Our knowledge level is increasing at such an extreme. Well, let me ask you a question. Do you think there will ever be a time that there will be things that we don't know? Interesting question. When Jesus was involved in conversation with Pontius Pilate, he made the statement in chapter 18 and verse 37. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. And Pilate said something that I think is probably characteristic of all of us when we think about especially science. What is truth? I mean, it's just something we ponder. When do we actually call it truth? When does it pass the point that it's a theory and it becomes an established, scientific, factual statement? Even then, sometimes when we think we've reached that point, we still have not. And we learn that something was wrong with our reasoning and we've made bad decisions. Don't let anybody try to make you believe that because you're a Christian, that you're some kind of a subhuman being. Because you're not. Don't let anybody try to make you believe that you're an uneducated person because you believe God exists. Because you're not. I want you to consider one thing as you end this lesson. And it's something that people really need to stop and think about. The Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 12. And it's a statement that you've heard probably many, many, many times. And the statement is, if a man thinketh he standeth, take heed lest he fall. Just think of that. Man has thought through the years that we've got the answers. And all of a sudden we discover we don't. Now, I think we need to be careful. You know, I don't have any problem having discussions. I don't believe people should ever be silenced. I think people need to say what they believe, and folks need to consider evidence. But on the other hand, we don't need to let people silence us by making us feel inferior. I believe in God. I don't have any hesitation to say that. I have no hesitation to say that there are a lot of things that man doesn't know, that there are a lot of things that science can't answer. And I believe that when time ends and this earth ceases to be, there will be scientific facts that have never been discovered, because I don't believe man has that capability. I just don't. Now, you may think I'm crazy. I don't. But I think sometimes we as Christians just need to reassure ourselves a little bit You know, if you would ask me what were my favorite classes in school and what was I best at, it was not English, because I wasn't very good at that. What it was, I don't believe in my entire time in high school, didn't go to college, so can't speak to that. In my entire time in high school, I think my average grade was 87. But I don't believe I ever had a grade that was less than a 95 in a science class, ever. I believe I'm a pretty scientific-minded person. Don't believe I ever had a grade in history that was lower than a 95. Now, get some other areas, that's a little different situation. Those areas I liked. History and science just absolutely captivated my attention. And they still do. Maybe that's the reason why sometimes my sermons turn out the way they do. I don't know. But they just captivate my attention. And I would caution you that when you think about all that's being said in the scientific community today, look at history. And see that some of the things that are being said today will not be being said tomorrow, because they will be discovered to be false. But there's one thing I have confidence in, that whatever is done, I don't believe they're going to prove that God doesn't exist. I don't believe that's going to happen. So I hope and trust that the lesson will be of some benefit to you. I don't know. But just be comforted, be strengthened. Don't let somebody browbeat you and make you believe that because you believe in God, you're a real problem to society. Because you're not. In fact, Jesus said a city that's set on a hill cannot be hid. You know, one of the things that the scientific community doesn't want to give you credit for, you live in a great country. Look at your Constitution. Look at the laws that govern you. Do they come from the scientific community, or do they come from the religious community? You might consider that. I know that there may be those who have never obeyed the gospel. I would encourage you to think about that. I know this has not been a first principle sermon, been primarily addressed to those who are believers in God and those who are already trying to faithfully serve Him. But if you're not a Christian, certainly give you this opportunity this morning to repent and be baptized for the remission of sins. And if as a Christian you think that you've sinned in some public manner, then certainly give you the opportunity to correct that as together we stand and as we sing.